appreciate your work and helping facilitate this. Yeah, so just give a basic background of where this comes from. The long story short was ADA has been law for 33 years. And so finally, we have the representation that we've been asking for, being the first elected living life in a wheelchair. When I was elected, I couldn't even do my job, right? So that shows you already right off the bat in the different ways that federal ADA, even though it's been law for 33 years, has not been applied, has not been taken seriously. So one of the ways that community identified that we could try and start making sure that we're pushing for real access and basic equity is by revamping the anti-discrimination laws that we have here in Colorado. Obviously, the result is not happening. If I'm getting elected and I'm the only one that is not able to do their job in 2020, that's telling you that the result is not being met. If our wheelchairs keep getting broken by airlines, that's telling you that the result is not being met. If I can go to places of businesses, like, for example, just driving to Alamosa for the Latino Caucus tour, trying to make a gas stop at a gas station, but there was no ramp to get in. And part of what I need to do is to use the restroom. So if the law's been there for 33 years and places are not accessible, then what we currently have is not working. So that's where the COTA fix came from originally. Originally, it included not just getting rid of administrative exhaustion and having to go through CCRD, which was the most important thing for us to get rid of, but we were also talking about emotional distress damages. And the reason why is because often a lot of what happens for us when it's lack of basic access isn't just or isn't financial. It very much is missing out on things that you get a once in an opportunity to participate in. For example, a mother missing out on her kids graduating because the venue wasn't accessible. They're never going to see their son graduate. You can't get that back. That's never going to be able to happen for them again, right? That's just one example of the different things that we're trying to tackle here for a law that's 33 years old, too. So I think a good place to start, the way that we always started in the military, was talking about what the mission statement was. Show of hands, how many people have read the actual ledge deck for the task force? All right, many of you, great. That's good to hear. So just to remind everyone, it goes in the fact that approximately 20% of Coloradans live with a disability. It says that Colorado is committed to protecting the civil rights of persons with disabilities and protections from discrimination and basic access to, and this is where the subcommittees come from, which is one, you guys being one of them, government services, housing, employment, recreation, and it's important for our well-being, right? So they go into that. I think something else that was great too was that it goes and defines what basic access is in this bill, because we in community don't just say that basic access allows us to go in and out, that basic access is public safety. And this is a way that I really want able-bodied people to start thinking of this way. Can you imagine if we constructed a building where 1 in 4 might come out of that building with a severe injury? That would never be allowed to exist. This is why we have our permitting codes around ensuring that buildings are constructed with the safety and access of able-bodied people in mind. It's time for people to start thinking about basic access for people with disabilities as a part of that safety. Anytime we can't get access somewhere, you are hurting us. That is a lack of safety built into that building. And that's what these COTA fixes are really trying to do, is making sure that we are stopping the harm and, excuse the pun, without crippling society, right? We're trying to figure out a way to get the result without doing harm. We're trying to get away so that people are informed of the law, but they can't keep using the fact that I didn't know as an excuse anymore, right? Like, what criminal court can that ever be used? Well, I just didn't know the law, right? And we're also talking about a law that's 33 years old. So it's your guys' job to have a robust, full discussion from different perspectives to talk about what are going to be the best ways to fix the anti-discrimination law so that people living with a disability can finally live an equitable life. I shouldn't be getting elected in 2020 and not being able to do my job, right? If I'm trying to do work and I have to take the airlines to travel, my chair shouldn't be getting broken. Or if I reserve a rental car because I'm also trying to do my job, I should be able to count on the fact that my reservation with the hand controls are going to be there, right? And I'm just giving you my specific example. And all of this all these discussions need to be rooted with that understanding on what basic access is, that it is a safety issue, but also what ableism is. And this is the last thing I really want to talk about, and defining and discussing what that is. Because I feel like a lot of people don't understand what that term is, or the fact that it exists, right? There's different types of ableism. There's malicious upfront ableism, but then there's subtle ableism that you don't even realize you have. And to be clear, like when I was first injured, I lived 30 years as a leg walker. I came with tons of internalized ableism, right? So if someone like me that lives this life had to go through their own journey to try and get over it, we all are going to have to take that journey together in these subcommittees and these committees in the way that we're passing laws to make sure that we're getting the end result. So ableism is the discrimination in favor of able-bodied people or discrimination of a social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. At its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing and defines people by their disability. An example of subtle ableism is calling our needs special needs. Our needs are not special, they're human needs, they're human rights. I have a right to access that gas station, whether it's to use a restroom, buy a snack, whatever. I have that right. I've earned that right. Everybody has. I mean, I obviously have earned it because this injury was a result of serving in Afghanistan and surviving a helicopter crash, but it doesn't matter. You don't have to have served in the military when you're living with a disability to deserve access to basic everyday life. So I really hope that the discussions are rooted with some of that understanding and a little bit of compassion and patience for each other as we start to flush out some of the more contentious issues. I think what we've discussed is probably the best thing to do is go after low-hanging fruit as a team so that together we can start solving the easier problems and then saving the tougher discussions and the tough solutions for later. But I'm really excited that you guys have decided to commit of your time. This task force was kind of a compromise to make sure that the more difficult issues can be discussed. And I don't envy, but I do appreciate Barrick and Carrie to taking that on and to be making sure and being committed that we do end up with some good legislation coming out of this. So I've talked for a lot. I'm going to leave it there. Just wanted to make sure that we were rooted in what the mission of the task force was, our understanding of what basic access is, what ableism is, and kind of what the goal is for this task force.
Thank you very much, Representative. Before I take us into this discussion, does anybody have any clarifying questions for Representative Ortiz or for us on what the charge is of this subcommittee and the history behind it that led to the task force and the subcommittee? Okay. I will continue to leave that door open as always. If you have questions at any time, I think we're small enough. I will ask most conversations for people to try to use the raise your hand function, but we're small enough that if it's inconvenient, I encourage you to just come off mute or to wave at me and just join the conversation. What I want to do, though, is we had what I thought was a pretty productive conversation a couple of weeks ago, really getting to understand where people were entering this conversation. And we talked about things like, what do you think is a misunderstanding others have about the perspective of you or the constituents that you represent or the community that you do? We also talked a little bit about how we think we cross some of those bridges. So I've got two questions that I'm going to ask of everybody before we get into mapping our inquiry and really talking about the law itself. And I'll give you time to think about both of them, but I'm going to ask you first to weigh in on what was your biggest takeaway from our first meeting? And that can be a single idea or aspect of the law or aspect of lived experience that stood out to you, or it could be about the dynamics of our group or other things. So what was your biggest takeaway? And then I'll ask you, what, if anything, surprised you? In this case, I'm going to start calling on people just to get the conversation started. And unfortunately, Ian, you find yourself in the top right of my screen, which means I call on you first. And then Lauren, I'm giving you the heads up. You're going to be next on my list. But Ian, my question for you, what was your biggest takeaway as you listened to all of your colleagues here on this subcommittee?
We got a lot of work to do. I mean, I knew we had a lot of work to do based on the work I've done in this space. But, you know, my biggest takeaway with this work is that it seems like this is the exact kind of group that we want doing this work. In that getting legislation passed as a stakeholder involves meetings with everybody who's in this task force. And so I think that was my biggest takeaway was that this is exactly what spending the last 3.5 years working on getting the CATA amended looked like. But this is distilled down to a group of people. We're going to be working with each other bi-weekly, at least for the rest of the year. And then I don't know how long for next year to get to a result that hopefully can avoid all of the stuff that we have to go through as stakeholders trying to get legislation passed. And I mean that in terms of being the pro disability rights, the pro employee rights side of this, meeting with the Chamber of Commerce and the business community, the Attorney General's office, and getting everybody to get on the same page while a bill is being run. I love this idea of coming at this from a perspective of, hey, this is what we did ahead of time. We had all the various stakeholders involved in coming up with the proposals. So that way we shouldn't then have to go through the same fights that happened to get these bills onto the floor and then passed. That was my biggest takeaway, that we got a lot of work to do, but we got all the right people in the room to do it.
Thank you.
And then you want me to answer that second question?
No, I'm going to come back around to this. I'm going to come back to the second one.
Okay.
I want to stay with takeaways, and then we'll get to the surprises, and then we'll talk aspirationally. But and I saw Rep. Ortiz smiling at the notion that we can get through the fights in this process. You floated the question of, you don't know how far into next year. I'll just answer it for you. We get to see each other all of next year.
Well, no, I know all
got
this.
a lot of
I
work.
don't know
Okay.
how frequently we'll be meeting all next year.
Understood. Very well then. I just wanted to make sure we were all there. Lauren and then Andrew, please. What was your biggest takeaway listening to your colleagues here on the subcommittee?
Lauren Schwartz speaking. Thank you for that question. I had so many takeaways. My first one is that I realize I don't know what I don't know. And I think I entered this process feeling like I was a few steps behind because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a policy wonk. But I am passionate, and that is something that I took away from this group. So I think that everybody who was asked to join this group was asked because they're passionate and they take it seriously. I feel like it is a great responsibility, and we have an opportunity to get things right. Even since that time, I think the reflection might be my biggest surprises to myself. The world is going to keep changing, and we'll have to revisit this in the future too, as technologies come on board, and as the world continues to evolve, so should our laws. And so anyway, but I think one of the biggest takeaways is everybody comes to this, regardless of their background, with varying perspectives and a lot of passion for the work. So
I appreciate that, Lauren. And I want to really name and call out something you said about people coming with a different level of knowledge about it. And I know there are some folks who would love us to be already all the way in the weeds and saying, hey, in section 3, part 4, we need to change the may to a shall, and we need to add this. We are going to take the time that is required for this diverse group to all feel informed about it, and then to be able to really dig into the conversation. So I appreciate everybody now and continuing forward saying, hey, I'm not as familiar with this. Can we spend a little time there? Because that's going to be critical to getting to what Ian mentioned, and what I know the rep wants is everybody at the end of this being able to say, I was fully informed, I was fully on board, and I'm fully supportive of what we're putting here in these recs. So I appreciate that, Lauren. I'm going to go to Andrew and then Tom Wheaton for initially, what was your takeaway from the conversation, Andrew? And you bring the perspective of somebody who spends a good amount of time on this.
Indeed. Thank you, Barrick. This is Andrew Montoya. So one thing I took away from the last meeting is we're going to have to ensure that in this process, we don't actually start slipping backwards. I heard some comments in the last meeting that let me know we're going to have to kind of guard against chipping away from what already exists. Some of those comments, for example, were talks about the intent of the people doing the discriminating or the entities doing the discriminating. As I began last meeting talking about, oftentimes disability discrimination isn't a matter of animus or even really intent. You don't necessarily intend something bad to happen to the person with a disability, but by virtue of not having a sign language interpreter or a ramp to get over a step, that person with a disability is still suffering that same level of discrimination. So we're going to have to make sure that we're really hitting that intent piece where it needs to be with respect to people with disabilities. One of the ways that I heard that manifested was talking about how something that may be off by a couple of inches is merely a technical violation. And that is not the case. I mean, again, the ADA is a law about inches. A matter of an inch or two can be the difference between being able to get through a door and not being able to get through a door. So those inches, those standards that exist are set for a reason. And, missing that standard isn't just a technical violation. It is discrimination.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to go to Tom Wheaton and then Tom Aker. And the question I'm going to put to you is, what was your biggest takeaway about the work we have ahead or where your colleagues were coming into this and just the dynamic that we're facing as we take this on?
Well, great. Barrick, this is Tom Wheaton. I first of all was extremely impressed with the fact that we have facilitators to really guide us well, and that I came away confident that my specific voice and perspective will be equal to others. So that in and of itself, I think, is a plus, and it gives me hope that we have a fighting chance to really have something of substance. And as Representative Ortiz said, some low-hanging fruit that can really sink some teeth into what we all want to accomplish. And with that, I also had the perspective, and I heard others talk about the onus. I think we're open-minded to what does the onus look like if there is fault. Who do we keep accountable? Is it the business owner only, or is it the approving authority that's falsely giving them this idea that they're in compliance? So I think we really need to dive into that a little bit. I was just excited that my colleagues saw that for what it was, like I do. And I also felt well heard when I explained in great detail that depression, anxiety, and perhaps even suicide are results of us who have felt violated. And that is real. And for us to try to water down what damages might look like or whatever, I think is something we want to hold strong on. But again, I would also say that I really appreciate the collective expertise of everybody, and I think we're going to come away with some stuff of quality. That was my biggest take.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to go to Tom Aker, then Alana, and then Cindy. Again, your biggest takeaways as you hung up the phone or turned off the computer after last week's or 2 weeks ago call.
Tom Aker, I will echo what Lauren had to say about not knowing what I don't know. I learned a lot in the first session, and also I was impressed probably with the diversity and where everyone is coming from that's on this subcommittee. I think that's going to help us get our job done a little bit easier because we come from a lot of different aspects within within Colorado and what we're looking at and why we're here.
Thank you, Tom. Alana and then Cindy. And Cindy, I'm going to tee you up that you're going to be the last to answer the question about the biggest takeaway, and then I'm going to have you roll right into if anything surprised you. But we'll first go with Alana and then Cindy on what was your big takeaway from the conversation we had at our first meeting?
Yeah, and I apologize. I'm going to stay off camera. I've been under the weather for the past week. But biggest takeaways from last time, definitely all of this is stuff I've been trying to kind of self-educate on over the past year or two, but there's still a ton that I need to learn and I'm actively learning. So I really appreciated how many different voices were in the room and how many of my own blind spots that I was able to continue to find and hopefully keep closing. So I'm looking forward to that for the rest of this time.
Thank you, Alana. And I know we all hope you get to feeling better soon. It seems to be that time of year when a lot of us get hit with things. So I hope you're better soon. Cindy, would love to hear one or both of your thoughts on your biggest takeaway and what, if anything, surprised you in what you heard or the dynamic in our last conversation?
Yes, this is Cindy. So, first of all, I think, in answer to, sort of what I learned, what I didn't know in our first meeting, I think several of you have said it really well. There's so much that I realized I don't know what I don't know. And there's such a scope covered under kind of the charge that we are left with to work on rewriting this that I sort of got off, and I know I talked to, you folks at Confluence separately, and I said, how in the world are we going to really define the scope of this? There's so much that we need to do. And, is meeting twice a month going to do that? So I think initially I was kind of overwhelmed a little bit about the amount of work, but at the same time, really impressed with the scope of the people that are included in the group that we will, be working with in the next year. I'm looking forward to it. I'm hoping that we can take a look at things that other states have done to sort of add to and strengthen their disability laws, because certainly Colorado has a long ways to go. As Representative Ortiz said really well, we've had a number of laws on the books for a long time, but they are not being followed. Simply, we're not taking them seriously. And if there's one thing that I could see a takeaway from this group, that we really work together to make this comprehensive and effective and accountable. Accountability measures are built in. That's probably the biggest takeaway I have is I think we have a great group, but we have a lot of work to do.
I agree, Cindy. We have a lot to do, but I'm confident we're going to do it. It's just going to be at a constant pace. Was there anything, Cindy, that surprised you? Either in what you heard or what you did not hear?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, I'm curious. During our last meeting, was there anything that you heard from others that surprised you, or that surprised you about the dynamics of the group and how we're approaching this?
Well, I think, and I'm not sure that I was really surprised. Mostly, I think I was just impressed at the variance, the diversity of the folks who are included. And I'm glad to know I'm the only, non-lawyer in the group. But I think I was surprised at, the amount of representation we have across, culturally with regard to disabilities and so forth. If anything, that would be it.
Thank you, Cindy. I'm going to go to Alana and then Tom Aker, and I'll expand that question a little bit. Was there something that surprised you in what you heard, in who you heard it from, in what you didn't hear, or was there just something new that you learned from that conversation? Alana, to you first, and then to Tom Aker.
Yeah, I'll really, sorry, lost my train of thought. Echo what Cindy said in that I was just kind of really happily surprised with the diversity of voices of where everybody else is coming from. I guess I kind of assumed that most people would be coming from a similar background or viewpoint. So I just really appreciated that. And when there were some starting to be disagreements or different viewpoints, it seemed like everybody was really listening to what everybody had to say, which is not always a guarantee when you get a big new group of voices together. So I really appreciated that.
Indeed, appreciate that. Alana, thank you. We'll go to Tom Aker and then Tom Wheaton with anything surprise you or just something new that you weren't aware of or didn't expect.
Tom Aker, I would say, I don't know if I was really surprised about anything, but one thing that sticks in my mind is I believe it was Tom Wheaton that mentioned that about opportunists out there that try to take advantage of the Disability Act for their own good. And it may not be the way I took it as it may be that it's more self-serving and they're just out trying to get a buck and they're really not trying to help the process along. So I think that's a big takeaway after being in a community that after I left had someone that was trying to just go after them to be, I'll say to be ornery. It's caused some change, but I think it was done the incorrect way.
Right. Thank you. Tom Wheaton and then Andrew Montoya.
Yeah,
Surprises or new things?
Yeah, Tom Wheaton. And yeah, unfortunately, I would like to think that what Tom just mentioned was the exception, not the rule. Because but when we see it, it rears its ugly head. And unfortunately, no matter what we put together, I think that will be a reality, unfortunately. But my biggest surprise from our initial meeting was really that nobody appeared to be territorial. I was actually expecting people to be kind of holding their cards a little closely, and maybe they have. I don't know, but I get a sense that we're going to come to consensus here as the months go on. So I'm optimistic in that. But again, if there's some poker players out there, maybe they've just hidden themselves well. We'll find out. Anyway, that was refreshing for me, is that there wasn't going to be anybody domineering or to say, hey, you all don't understand. I understand better than all of you. So glad we're in a good place on that.
Appreciate those thoughts, Tom. I'm going to go to Andrew and then Lauren and then Ian.
Thank you, Barrick. This is Andrew Montoya. I can't really say that I had any surprises from the last get together, but a pleasant takeaway was that it seemed like everyone who was involved in this subcommittee truly is centered around disability rights. We may come at it from different perspectives, and in fact may not agree on everything, but that heart of still trying to achieve the best for disability rights really does seem to permeate the membership.
Lauren and then Ian.
Andrew, I think you couldn't have said it better. Exactly had the same perspective. It's funny because I think that some of us were chosen to represent different areas of the community. I know because I work for a chamber, I'm chosen to to represent business, but I think no surprise. I think all of us are interested in progress, and we're all representing the disability community as well, or want to support moving forward in a productive way. So I really stumbled through that, but I guess that's not a surprise, but maybe something that gave me optimism and inspiration.
Thank you. I think everybody here really appreciates the authenticity. Ian, you get the final thoughts on if anything surprised you or was new to you.
Thanks, Barrick. Ian Kalmanowitz. This kind of follows up on what Tom Haker and Tom Wheaton had to say, and I was a little bit surprised by some of those comments about the potential for frivolous lawsuits being brought, and that is something that we contend with, in this area of the work and the side of the work that I mostly am oriented on and representing individuals, in bringing these claims, is that they're often accused of doing it to make a buck or of bringing frivolous lawsuits. And, given that we're in this committee to make these changes, it was a bit of a surprise, to hear that that's a concern. But I think that that's an area that is good to hear about at the very beginning, because I do think it's something that we can all work on and discuss, and really hope to ameliorate any concerns about the one bad apple idea here that spoils the whole bunch, right? The one person who might have brought a case for a bad reason because of being ornery, right, is the outlier. And that what we're not dealing with here in these situations are people who are looking at, I would look at this and say, based on everybody having hopefully read CADA before today, it's not like there's a whole lot of money to get made by bringing these cases. So with that being said, I do think that was a surprise for me, but it's also a good surprise. And I'm glad we, at least that I heard it early on, because it's certainly an area I think that we can all, discuss and work on as we work through this process.
Appreciate that. And this is Barrick again. And I'm going to say something that may sound contradictory. I was inspired by the amount of agreement and alignment, and my task for the next months ahead is going to be to get you guys to disagree. And I'm going to ask you, though, to disagree without being disagreeable. And the reason I say that is because if we have 20 meetings where nobody disagrees, I don't think we've put cards on the table. If everybody agreed, we wouldn't have a subcommittee. There would have been a bill that was passed unanimously with nobody objecting. If everybody agreed, we wouldn't have the need to do this. So I'm going to push everybody in the coming weeks and months to get pretty uncomfortable. And what I'm going to ask everybody in that process is things like disagree without being disagreeable, own your own opinion and your truth, and assume the best intentions of others. We're going to get into some disagreements. We're going to find places where people fundamentally see things differently. What I'm going to push us to do is to understand why and to try to find those paths forward where when one person has a concern about something, can we find common ground that addresses that while fundamentally moving this ball forward in a ways that other states haven't been able to. I truly believe that Colorado has the opportunity to lead the nation on this. And I can think of nothing better as we look at our 150th anniversary coming up in 2026 than for Colorado to have planted our own flag and said everybody is equally. So I hope that you're all willing to commit to that discomfort, that those moments when we disagree, because we're going to get to a much better place by doing so. And with that, it's probably time to get a little wonky here. It's also a place where if I'm going to ask you guys to put your cards on the table, I'll put mine there. We've got a conversation to have about the law. And I had hoped last week that I'd be able to have a brilliant panel of legal experts. It's been a little bit of a game of hot potato, trying to find somebody who says, yes, I can come in and I'm completely comfortable that I will be seen as unbiased. So we're still working to put that together. We are going to make it happen. Representative Ortiz and his aide, Sarah, have been fantastic connecting us with legislative services and legal counsel there. As you all know, no matter how many voices we get, somebody is going to say they had their own biased interpretation of it. So our job is to make sure you get multiple perspectives. And I don't see this as we'll get you two sides. This is a parallelogram with multiple sides, multiple perspectives. What we want to do is put all of the interpretations on the table, but look at all of this through the focus of what you all want to have accomplished through this work. So we're going to spend the next 15 plus minutes talking about the law itself. And I don't expect everybody, particularly the non-lawyers, to have received one copy and now be legal experts. But I think what's important is that we start having conversations that are accessible, that break this down out of the legalese and into what does this mean for real people? What does this mean for that 3-inch difference in that ramp or that entry size? And what does it mean for people being able to seek redress if they've been wronged? So hopefully you had a chance to go through the version of CADA that was sent around. As I said, we'll continue to do our job of educating everybody. But as you went through it, you saw starting with section 3 and going into 4, where we talked about employment, and 5 around housing, and section 6 around places of public accommodation, and 7 getting into things like discriminatory advertising, and as 8, as we get into the fundamental issues of the civil rights of persons with disabilities. I'd like to invite everybody to enter this conversation. We talked 2 weeks ago about what were the big things people thought we needed to address. And people put out things like emotional distress, and what were the limits depending on business size, or whether it was intentional and malicious or out of ignorance. But I'd love to hear now, we need to, as Rep Ortiz said, hopefully we can identify some low-hanging fruit where we say, hey, on these 12 things, we fundamentally agree. On these 3, we need to push through. And on these 4, we're probably going to knock heads for a few months. So let's give us the time. But I would love to just open up the table to everybody of what, as you went through CADA, or based on your work with it or your experience being subject to it, jumped out as you that you'd like to add to the list of, hey, we need to change the language here to make sure equal means equal. And normally I'm going to ask Rep Ortiz to stay here as an observing member, but I think because you've spent so much time on this, that Rep, I'll ask the members to speak first, but if you are hearing things or not hearing things that you think need to be on our radar, I'd love for you to jump in. So, yeah.
If I can do so right off the bat, just to frame the discussion, I share Andrew Montoya's concerns about intent. Like that is something that we constantly hear. And a law that's 33 years old, like discrimination is discrimination. intent's irrelevant, right? If we need to build in systems so that that's more clear at the beginning when it comes to permitting, right? Like, you don't, when someone creates fire hazards or a building that's unsafe for able-bodied people, there's no discussion about intent. They broke the law, they're liable. Where those discussions go. So right off the bat, that's something that gives me concern. The one thing we're definitely not here to do is to roll back the protections we already currently have. So that's definitely not something that we're looking to do here. And this discussion about drive-by frivolous lawsuits is another one that I always find it's kind of like a red herring or, you know, a straw man for these discussions. One, we already have laws on the books that deal with lawyers that do frivolous lawsuits, right? We already have that covered. So which is why I'm calling it a strong man. And two, if there is a lawyer from the outside that sees this, it's not like he's making bank or money. That's not how this works. Otherwise, there would be a line of lawyers in Colorado already that would be litigating these lawsuits, and they're not. So just to make that very, very clear, Andrew Montoya and Jack Johnson and lawyers like that could be making much more money practicing a different type of law than what they're doing here. So this idea that frivolous lawsuits, it's just a straw man. That's not, we already have laws in the books, and two, that's not flushed out by one, the number of lawsuits you see, and two, I'm not seeing Andrew Montoya wearing a three-piece suit and driving around in a Rolls Royce, right? Like that's a straw man. That's not how it's happening. And three, if the result of these lawsuits is greater access because someone was violating a 33-year-old law, then good, greater access. That's what we're going for here. Like that is the goal, is not to be ignoring a 33-year-old law. Now, if there's something that we can build in the permitting that makes it easier for businesses, like those are the type of solutions that I want to hear, right? If we put some of the onus back on county and state government to make sure they're informing and educating and training, completely open to that. But just want to make sure that we are staying away and not spending too much time. Again, like if there's some learning that can happen in making these discussions, then great, I want to have those discussions then. But I don't want this task force to be another vehicle for the same old complaints that aren't getting us greater access. So that's right off the top. Just want to put that out there.
Appreciate that. And I may pick on our lawyers a little bit initially in this conversation, but I don't want anybody who's not a lawyer, and I mean this sincerely. I don't want anybody who's not a lawyer to feel that you need to cede the ground to the lawyers just because they spent time in the in and outs of the statute and the law and case law, and they've been in the court. I want people to really speak from an experience level. We will work with legal experts to shape the language. What I really want this subcommittee to focus on for now is what should the Coloradan experience be by us changing this law? What needs to change for the individual who has faced wrongdoing, and what do we need to make clear for people like businesses? The one thing I do want to flag as we go into this is that we do have sections 3 through 8. 8 is a little different in that that's not enforced by the Colorado Civil Rights Division. And if we get into a conversation where we're talking about changing, for example, the definitions of disability, we will have to make sure that we've got legal eyes on that, and that it where it intersects with things like federal contracts and EEOC and other things. That's not to say that Section 8 by any means is off the table. I just want to name who does and doesn't enforce that and some of the intersectional issues there. But Andrew and Ian, to just get the conversation started, I am going to pull you guys in first, but I want everybody to have equal time on this. When you think about the law itself, in addition to the things that we've named around emotional distress and who could be, are there tiers depending on business size or the malicious intent? Are there things you would stack onto those that, hey, within emotional distress, we really need to consider ABC, or are there other aspects of CADA that you think we need to have on the table? And we'll talk later about what is tier 1 because we can get it easy, and what's going to be tier 3 because we're going to knock heads. Andrew, I'm going to ask you to jump in first.
Thank you, Barrick. This is Andrew Montoya. So a few things jumped out at me while going over the entirety of the CADA. One is I think there's really some super low-hanging fruit, not to get too into the weeds with legal things, but for example, the term qualified individual with a disability and individual with a disability, those two phrases are defined in Part 3. referring to federal law. Well, federal law doesn't have a definition of individual with a disability. It does have a definition of qualified individual with a disability, and that does come into play a little bit when you're talking public entity versus public accommodation. But I think that's really low-hanging fruit in that we can simply define that rather than referring to federal law that doesn't exist. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. I don't anticipate a whole lot of pushback with those sorts of things. Something else I identified is there are several parts within CAUTA where the commission is instructed to provide some public education about things like employers' obligations or obligations for housing providers regarding service animals and emotional support animals. I think we should also include some education for public entities and places of public accommodation regarding their obligations. Something I heard both during this meeting and our previous meeting was that there's a lot of ignorance, for lack of a better word, about what the law requires. I don't think you'll ever get me to agree that something like, a couple of inches is a technical violation, but still, I think there could be a lot more public education regarding the obligations of both government agencies and business owners out there. In speaking with community, something else I would like to see added, and this may be another, kind of big ticket item to flag, much like emotional distress, but would be to incorporate the Department of Justice's 2010 Standards for Accessible Design into state law. As we've seen, there have been some chipping away at both federal laws and the regulatory state at the federal level by the Supreme Court. Those standards exist and they go into excruciating detail. You wouldn't believe the pages and pages of standards that exist governing bathroom accessibility, for example. But those are all critical standards that if they go away at a federal level, we in the state are going to be left scrambling. Someone had mentioned looking at what other states have done and how they may have addressed things like this. Texas, for example, has incorporated the 2010 standards into the Texas law and in fact improved on some of those standards for some kind of Texas-specific things. I would love to see that happen in Colorado, incorporating the 2010 standards and, perhaps massaging them to meet some of Colorado's specific things. Snowfall and, mitigating snow on roads and sidewalks and things like that is a perfect example that I think we could do some Colorado-specific things, but we need to incorporate those 2010 standards into state law so that should something happen at a federal level, they're not going to go away. Something else I personally would like to see happen is extending some of the timelines for people filing claims with the commission. Oftentimes things are set at 30, 60, 90 days, things like that. And those are frankly unrealistic for a lot of people, especially people with disabilities who may have communication issues. As Representative Ortiz mentioned, there's not a whole lot of lawyers lining up to take these cases for people with disabilities. So it's often quite tough for someone with a disability to get through that process in the first place. But then they've got a tight turnaround time on trying to find a lawyer to file a lawsuit. If they get a right to sue letter, for example, I think we need to extend some of those timelines, provide a little more parity between that and what exists under usual statutes of limitation. And then finally, as a couple of folks have said, I think we should build in some burdens on approving entities, building departments, things like that, to make sure that they are actually checking for compliance with those 2010 standards for accessible design that I was talking about earlier before issuing things like certificates of occupancy and other documents that may cause business owners to believe that they are in compliance when that is not the case.
This is Barrick jumping back in. Andrew, thank you very much. I think that's probably why I called on you first. I knew you would have some very specific things. And as you said, I really appreciate you naming some simple things we can do if this is what this group chooses to recommend, like creating definitions in Colorado statute, in addition to the other things. I'm going to go next to Ian. I'm going to ask all of the members of the subcommittee, as you hear your peers on this subcommittee offering thoughts, the other thing I want you to be thinking about, in addition to aspects of CAUTA that you think we should be exploring, I need you to be thinking about what you need to learn and what we can bring to you in terms of presentations and background information for you to have informed conversations about some of these topics that are coming up so that we can come to informed recommendations that hopefully get the full consensus of this group. So with that, Ian, I would love for you to jump in here, and then I'm going to open the floor before I start just calling on people. I'll let people volunteer. But Ian, I'm going to volunteer you right now What else do we need to be looking at in CADA?
Sure. Thanks, Barrick. Ian Kalmanowitz. First, I want to thank you for advising everybody else on the subcommittee not to cede their ground, because they're hearing stuff from lawyers like Andrew and me who work in this space. And I want to invite you all to challenge us. And frankly, if there's something that's confusing or you don't understand why we are recommending it, challenge us on it, because that's the best way for us to have a fruitful dialogue about these things. I agree with Andrew, particularly with respect to the exhaustion. One of the things that I noted, in reviewing again, last night in preparation for today, the different sections of CADA are the differing time limits for exhaustion. 300 days for an employment claim versus 1 year for a housing claim versus 60 days for a public accommodation claim. There's no reason why, if we're going to require exhaustion, we can't have a uniform standard for exhaustion across the differing types of protections that are afforded to everyone. And so I think that's probably one of the lowest pieces of fruit that's hanging in front of us, is making exhaustion uniform or getting rid of it entirely. And I know that was something that had been proposed as some legislation a few years ago as part of the Power Act, the first version of it that I worked on in 2020 and 2021. And there was a lot of pushback from the legislature about that, because of the fight that had happened a few years earlier to keep the CCRD from going away. And that's something that I think is another piece of potential low-hanging fruit here in Section 304. It calls for a repeal of Part 3 in September of 2027. And I don't think this is, so what would happen here is if Part 3 is repealed and the CCRD no longer exists, there's no place for anyone to exhaust. And if no one can exhaust, it means no one can file a charge of discrimination. And how do you bring a claim where the statute says you have to exhaust first? I think those are things that can easily be fixed, right? That either by addressing the exhaustion requirement entirely, or having something in there as sort of like a fail-safe in the event that the CCRD is not renewed in 2027, that won't make all this work for naught. If a legislature decides not to fund the CCRD, there's another way for individuals to bring these claims. I think those two are low-hanging fruit that shouldn't engender a whole lot of ideological differences or political differences. I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe there is a good reason why housing claims get a year for exhaustion and public accommodation only gets 60. I don't know what it is. Beyond that, I think that having uniform remedies across the panoply of protected, I guess, types of discrimination, employment, housing, public accommodation, putting it all uniform, right? And again, I mentioned this, I think, in our first meeting, that, the availability of certain kind of remedies for employment cases, tries to recognize the harm that people suffer if they lose their job because of disability, or they're not granted an accommodation because of their disability, or any other protected status for that matter. But focusing on disability here, having the ability to recover emotional distress damages because you were fired because of your disability, I don't see why being denied the ability to purchase a home because of your disability should also result in you not being able to recover similar remedies, or being denied the ability to Rep. Ortiz gave the example of a woman seeing her kid graduate. Why should you not be able to recover the similar emotional distress damages there as you could in an employment case? And then that gets us into that discussion about emotional distress. And then for me, as I mentioned, 2 weeks ago, a big concern as well is the existence of these caps. And the caps, and this would be, in 405, 2434, 405 is where the caps are referenced. And the caps as they exist right now are only written into the law with dollar amounts for very small employers, those with less than 15 employees. And then it incorporates federal law for the caps on the non-economic damages, the emotional distress and punitive damages for the larger employers with 15 or more, larger, right? 15 or more employees. But those caps, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, are from 1991. So they're almost as old as the ADA, and they're in 1991 dollars, not in 2023 dollars. And a $50,000 emotional distress award might have, against a business with 100 employees, might have seemed like a big award in 1991. It's nothing now comparatively, based on the inflation that we've been seeing just in the last couple of years, let alone all the changes in the value of money over the last 30 years. So that would be something that I do think is, and that's where I think we are going to run into more of a potential ideological dispute, or a problem in finding consensus, is how to address those issues. But those are also, I think, the hard discussions that we have to have, given the charge that we've been given.
Really appreciate that, Ian. Andrew, I saw your hand go up. I also see that the Lieutenant Governor has joined us. Did you have something you wanted to layer in quickly on Ian's, or do you want to reserve it?
If I may briefly, this is Andrew Montoya. I simply wanted to point out that last session, we were able to pass a bill that did away with administrative exhaustion requirements for public entities and public accommodations. So just to clarify that.
Thank you, Andrew. And with that, Lieutenant Governor Primavera, thank you so much for joining us. As you jumped in and we're overhearing, we're starting the conversation about specific sections of CATA that we need to look at. But we are so grateful for your leadership in taking the time to chair, along with Vice Chair Representative Ortiz, and want to give you the floor for a few minutes to welcome folks and to share your perspective on your aspirations and hopes for this task force and for this subcommittee in particular.
Well, thank you. And I apologize. I was actually on earlier, but I had some technical difficulties, and then I had to jump off and jump back on. So I just want to say good afternoon. And I am the Lieutenant Governor, and I do have the honor of chairing the task force on the rights of Coloradoans with disabilities. I have a long history of working in the disability community. So thank you all for participating in this important effort to clarify and improve the disability sections of the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act, or CATA. There's not been a substantial update to these sections of statute since 2014, when Senate Bill 14-118 was passed, and I actually co-sponsored that bill when I was in the House. And ensuring the civil rights of Coloradoans with disabilities are protected is an important component in Colorado for All, which is what Jared and I have been working towards. Clear, easily understood statutes will help businesses and government agencies to comply with CATA, and if needed, will make it easier for people with disabilities to enforce their rights through litigation. So I know there will be both areas where everyone on this subcommittee agrees, and I know there'll be areas where there is disagreement. But my ask of you is to keep your discussions and debates civil, and try and keep an open mind to each other's points of view, because usually there's valid points of view on both sides. So I just wanted to stress to you that your work is very important. And while the task force will be getting updates, my staff will be joining most of your meetings and keeping me updated on all of your progress as well. So thanks again for your commitment to this really important work. The other members of the task force and I look forward to the forthcoming recommendations from this subcommittee, as well as the other 3 subcommittees that will be sent to us in the next 13 months. So that's really all I wanted to tell you, is just thank you again for your time and your commitment, and I'll try and listen into the rest of the meeting.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. So with that, I'll turn it back to the group and just to reground us. As Andrew and Ian said, the lawyers don't know everything. Sometimes I think they may get so caught up, and this is with all love and respect. My father is a lawyer as well. Lawyers get so caught up in the law that I think it's important that we lay people have the opportunity to say, but here's how I experience it as somebody living, as somebody having to navigate. So as Ian said and Andrew said, I appreciate you both, really being open to, there are no expert voices that are above the others in this conversation. It's important that we all speak up. So I will, before I call on people, I will give people the opportunity to volunteer and welcome you either reacting to things you heard from Ian or Andrew, or naming things. And when I say things in kata, you can do like Ian and Andrew did and say this particular section, or if it's more of a general outcome. If there's something where you want to say, I want to make sure that we accomplish this with how we rewrite it. I want to give every member of this subcommittee the opportunity to speak up to what you would like to see us address as we tackle this rewrite.
Well, this is Tom Wheaton. I'll go first, if that's okay. This is difficult for me because I know we want progress and what could be eventually passable, by the state. But the one thing that I struggle with is caps at all for any reason, no matter what size of the entity is. And if we talk about just the idea of discrimination, if somebody is racially discriminated against, are there caps? Or other protected classes, are there caps? I'm curious about that because this doesn't seem like apples and oranges to that, in my opinion. So I struggle with the idea of caps at all, because if a encounter is so egregious, why would that be limited? We've had lawyers at PVA for decades. One of them said to me back in the 1990s, he goes, the great thing about America, and this is a lawyer speaking, is that anybody can sue anybody for any reason at any time. And I thought that was interesting take on that. But, if we have caps, then that really isn't true. Not that should be the carrying weight of how to live civilly amongst each other, but I struggle with caps at all, and probably need guidance from others as to why they make sense, or why, if we just index things from 1991, if that's like the easy way to go, or if we should just advocate for not having caps. So that's the one thing that I struggle with.
Tom, I appreciate it. And I want to respond to a few things you said there. One, I think this is exactly what we want to surface, and it may be that's a dedicated conversation we need to have, where everybody gets comfortable being uncomfortable with sharing their argument for or against and the different perspectives. It may also be a place where we lean on some of you, in addition to our state partners, to find some folks that can bring different perspectives for us to consider. The last thing you mentioned is about being bold with our recommendations. And the comment I'm about to make in no way speaks directly to caps or to any one recommendation, but it will be to our broader work. We as a subcommittee will be presenting our work and our findings and recommendations to the task force. The task force will intake them and process them and take them into consideration and make their own recommendations. Based on the task force's recommendations, the state may or may not make recommendations. The legislature will do what the legislature does. All of this I bring up to say there's going to be a lot of layers, and nowhere in any of these processes in my 15 years of doing this have I heard anybody in any one of those layers say, you know what, you weren't bold enough. We are going to go bolder. In my experience, and I would love for this to be the exception, what we offer needs to be the most aspirational, because somebody may chip away at it. So I want people to think boldly and set the highest possible bar in trying to find common ground on how we're going to tackle this. And again, I don't have opinions on any one of these. I'm just going to be pushing everybody here to put it all on the table and reach for as much as we can in every aspect from every point of view on this. Ian, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks, Barrick. Ian Calmano. I was just raising my hand to offer if you wanted me to chime in on the existence of caps in response to Tom's question, if that would be helpful for the discussion, or if you want to table that for a later point in time. But I could really quickly just run through, what we're looking at in terms of various caps, in terms of various types of discrimination.
I'm going to ask you to actually maybe offer something different. What I don't want today to become is the discussion of the issues themselves. I'd rather today really is a scoping conversation of what are the pieces we need to get into, because I don't want any one conversation to try to get encapsulated into one piece. But if you'd like to weigh in on what do we need to talk about to have an informed, comprehensive conversation on caps, I would invite that, and then I will of course bring you into all conversations to debate and haggle over it.
Well, yeah, sure. In that respect, I think the thing to consider if we're going to be talking about caps is that we actually have to talk about the harm that people suffer when they suffer this discrimination. I think that's where the discussion has to start. If and it's not a discussion about things like a matter of inches or a technical violation. It's a discussion about the actual harm that is visited upon people who are denied access, who are denied housing, who are denied employment because of a disability. And we have to, I think that's an uncomfortable discussion to have, and Tom Wheaton mentioned it in our first meeting. We talked about the emotional distress, the depression, people maybe becoming suicidal. I think those are hard discussions to have, but those are the discussions that we have to have when we're then getting to the notion that the government has just sort of arbitrarily decided that regardless of how bad the harm you might have suffered was to you, that you can recover no more than the amount that was determined by the legislature on a certain day because of a certain compromise that needed to be reached.
I appreciate you naming that it's not just about debate, the yes, the no, the caps, the dollar figure. It's what's behind that. So I think that's going to obviously not just be one meeting. I think we're going to have multiple meetings, hearing multiple perspectives, and then some very uncomfortable conversations with all of us working through different perspectives on that. Other members of the subcommittee, thinking about the full breadth of CADA, and to the extent you either had a chance to read the law or you're familiar with it from your work or from what you're hearing, what pieces of CADA do you want to make sure that we say, let's take a real hard look at this, and whether they're the really complex, potentially contentious, or maybe that low-hanging fruit, what is on your list?
Here, I'll go.
Please.
Hi, it's Lauren. I'm going to jump in with my little list as I was reading through CADA. And some of the things I think I mentioned in the first discussion that I think I'm coming as representative of the business community. People want clarity, and they want to know the law because they want to do the right thing. I think most people do. Let's be sure, there are some bad actors out there, right? We can all agree. And there's some folks who aren't going to pay attention. And so I want to be clear, on the intentionality and the maliciousness. I think there is a difference between those who act in good faith and those who just ignore because they don't want to deal or they're the bad actors. I like to think that the bad actors are in the minority. And to that, as I was reading through it, I was looking for things, but I don't know what I don't know. When Andrew was talking about the changes in federal ADA, I knew that there had been some changes, but I just don't know the specifics. And so, codifying some of those standards in Colorado law, I think is something we could all agree with, because we all want to know what to do. We all want to know how to give the most access to the most employees, the best employees, and as well as customers if you're a business. So there's some motivation there. And to that end, even in the statute, reading through it, it's so vague about the education, and that'll be posted on the state's website. And well, is the website accessible? And that is going to be something that all public access will need to face, and that's being tested in courts, particularly on the East Coast. And so I think that bears discussing too, is that access to that education and website accessibility too. Looking at the caps, I mean, I was just kind of, that was maybe a big surprise for me, is that there was actually a dollar amount listed in the statute. It's how ridiculous, knowing, as Ian pointed out, there's inflation. So I think if you are going to put some measure, I would say let's base it on the percentage of the salary or some other measure that changes with time and as the economy changes, if that makes sense. I'm having a hard time articulating that.
And we will undoubtedly get into a long conversation about how we calculate that in a future call. So
yeah.
Like
and I think I mentioned earlier, this, well, it already been said, but just having that opportunity for public access to remediate a problem if they do discover, I bought this building to set up my business, for instance. I thought it was accessible, it has a ramp, and then come to find out it's off. How much time do I have to remediate that? The damage has been done. I understand that ignorance is not an excuse, but I think that some people are acting in good faith and still breaking the law. So I have to keep that in mind. And then, one of the things when it comes to the caps discussion too, and this comes from a personal conversation with a friend who places exclusively people with disabilities into jobs nationwide. I mean, one of the biggest barriers that he says he has is the fear of getting sued. So I want to make sure that we don't go too far to a point that we are hurting the very constituents who I think we all want to help, and not just help, just give basic access to. Let's not create that bias in employers or perpetuate one that exists, unfortunately. And of course, that's just me talking with one person in my brain trust, but it is something that I take very seriously, because I want us to all get to the same place that I think we all want to arrive to, and not have unintended consequences.
Thank you, Lauren.
And one last thing, and yes. I think just to go back to the discussion, sorry. One last thing is, I do want us to pay, and I'm going to rely on those of you who are lawyers, where is the language conflicting with federal law, and where could we provide clarity? I mean, one of the things that I ran across, just looking at service animals versus how do they call them? In our statute, it's service versus
assistance animals.
Assistance animals. Thank you. Is that a term? And do we need the word assistance? And even looking at that, like, landlords can ask for documentation. I didn't think that landlords could, other than let's document that there's a service animal there for the safety of the animal. If there's a fire, we need to get these animals out. Anyway, going down a rabbit hole, but those are the kinds of things that just strike me, that I think the more clarity we can provide for people to do the right thing, we're all going to get to that finish line in a better way. So that's it.
No, thank you, Lauren. Cindy, you came back on camera. I want to go to you first, and then Alana, I see your hand up, so I'll go to you just after Cindy.
Cindy, thank you so much. I'm sorry, I'm having my own technical difficulties with raising hands, so I appreciate you noticing that. I just want to go and comment on a couple of things. Andrew, when he was speaking earlier, mentioned, taking a look at not just referencing federal law such as the ADA, and 150% agree with that. I know as I was reading through the law, every time that is referenced, the assumption is, of course, that it's easy to find, I guess, and easy to understand. The fact is, most people, unless you're a lawyer or your job brings you in routine contact with this sort of legislation, they don't know the law. They really do not know the law. And Joe Average doesn't know the difference between ADA, 504, ICT, that is Information Communication Technology, laws and so forth. And those are all federal. They don't know that versus Colorado law. And we have a really serious problem in Colorado. People don't not only know the law, they don't worry about it. They don't worry about breaking it. Whether or not they intend to do it or they're doing it through ignorance, they're breaking the law. I'm going to give you an example. Lauren referenced service animals. I have a number of friends who use guide dogs. I do not currently use a guide dog, but my dad and my mom both did. And as you know, probably most of you, these are dogs who are highly trained. They take more than 2 years to prepare before an owner can even take possession of them, begin utilizing them. But folks that I know weekly are being refused rides on Uber by drivers who think they don't have to transport them. And they say, I don't care what the law is, I'm not letting your dog in my car. And so I happen to work with RTD on their advisory board, and we asked for right now to relieve some of this. That, for example, Uber offer Uber Pet. I think we all know service animals are not a pet, but at least this gives somebody who has a service animal the option to set up a reliable ride. That's a sad story in Colorado, and that's just one example. Digital access is another, and it's a huge one, as I think we probably all know. But the fact is, we talk about cats and we talk about defining the law. We need to worry first about, we have a number of laws on the book and we need to rewrite them in plain language, but we also need to make sure that there's something in there that makes people respect it, worry about it, maybe be afraid of being sued, because I don't think that's the case.
Thank you, Cindy. Appreciate that. Alana.
Thank you. Yeah, this is Alana. First of all, I just wanted to say, Cindy, I love what you said about people not knowing the law, but also not worrying about breaking it. That's a sentence that's going to be sitting in my head for the rest of the day. And that was really well said. Thank you. The other thing I wanted to say is, all honesty, I have not read most of the law yet. I was busy being sick, and I was not going to be able to retain anything I read. But what I will be, the lens I plan to read it through over the next couple of days, and that I hope this will be relevant to everyone. But one, thinking about best practices of anywhere where our laws don't agree with or don't line up with where other states or the federal government has done it better, and we know that it's better elsewhere, but we can just, again, kind of lift that wholesale and use that as our starting point and see if we can even make it better again. And then the other two things, the places I am most often find myself getting burned at work is with definitions and metrics, either because people will come in with different assumptions on what a definition is, because everybody will be using the same word but with different definitions behind it, or with metrics where we'll set something up and we think we're measuring one thing, but we're actually measuring something else. So anywhere in the laws where we have common definitions, common metrics, especially when we're trying to measure the impact of maybe discrimination on individuals or on businesses or whatever the impacts are, I want to make sure that we're being really careful in how we define those metrics to make sure we're all on the same page and make sure that we're having the impact that we want to be having, especially with all of the discussion about impact versus intent, to make sure that ours lines up and we are having the best possible impact to go along with our good intent. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Alana. We've got just over 10 minutes left. And in a minute, I'm going to spend a good stretch of that hearing from you on what you need to learn to be able to have the conversations that have just been laid out in front of you. And I will recognize the first thing for a lot of folks is understanding CADA for the non-lawyers. And that's where I say our next meeting, we will have the opportunity to be presented about the law, so we can dig into that. Before I ask for what else you need to learn, Representative Ortiz, I know you're here really as an observer, but I don't know of anybody who has spent more time thinking about how this law needs to be rewritten. So I want to give you a couple minutes to either react to what you're hearing or to put on the floor other things that you would ask this subcommittee to be considering, knowing this will be a continuing conversation, and you and I will probably talk weekly about what we need to be discussing here.
Right. I mean, I really think that Cindy said it best for me. One was in plain language, so business owners and ordinary folk can understand. Like, I think that is really key about the rewrite here, is that we put it in very plain language so that it is very clear and digestible. The other part, though, too, that really resonated with me was they're breaking the law and they're not afraid to break the law. And the example of Uber is just one indignity that we live every day. Every day. So, and again, this is not to be like malicious back, but there needs to be accountability, and it needs to be painful to break this law. Just like if you're breaking fire code and something happens in your shop and people die, it is painful. That is obvious liability. That is baked in. The safety of able-bodied people is baked into the law. The goal of this is that the safety and access of disabled people needs to also be baked into the law, right? The result of discrimination has been going on for too long. And I'm not here to try and make it needlessly painful, but it needs to be a law that people go out of their way to learn about. It's our job to make it digestible and clear, but it needs to be accountable and painful enough that there is a healthy respect and fear for breaking the law. That is kind of what I hope that we get to, because eventually it's going to become second nature as curb cuts, right? It's going to become second nature as fire codes. It's going to become second nature as everything else that goes into making sure that people can get in or out safely. And just to kind of offer the perspective that this is the stuff that we have to deal with and see every day. I mean, the disabled community was begging for virtual participation to work, for volunteering, everything. But it wasn't until COVID-19 and able-bodied individuals were threatened that all of a sudden we figured this out. And look at, we're using it every day now to make everyone's life accessible and easier. So I guess at the end of the day, like for me, Cindy said it best. And I think the clarity part and the easily digestible part is something that everybody's still low-hanging fruit, right? I saw Lauren and Tom both shaking their heads, and I think that could be a great starting place for this task force to kind of bond over and agree on and work together on to get some easy W's under their belt before diving into the heavier discussion. So I'm just excited to see what comes out of this work group. From everyone's comments so far, it seems like everyone's here to do the genuine work and to have the tough discussions, but to do the genuine work. So let us know what you need. There's been plenty of stakeholdering work. Like, I've offered to give Barrick and everyone access to all the stakeholders that we've spoken with. If there's somebody that has a certain profession that you'd like to hear a presentation from, Barrick will make that happen. If you want a one-pager of what the original version of the bill said, so you know specifically the other issues to start with, as well as whatever else you decide to, I'm here as a resource, and I'm here to support all of y'all. So I really appreciate the work you're doing, and I'm excited to see what comes from it.
Thank you, Representative. Madam Lieutenant Governor, is there anything you would like to add in on aspects of CATA you want to make sure we talk about, or reflections on what you've heard? I'm not sure if she's in a place to be able to. I know there's some tech glitches going on over there.
Well, we had Carrie mute her just in case she had this on her, she can get off mute.
I'll come back to her in just a minute. I know how things can get over there. Quick round robin, and Lauren, I'll get to you first. I would love to do a lightning round of, is there something based on what you heard today you want to make sure you have the opportunity to learn about? But first I'm going to go to the LG.
Hi, sorry, I'm driving at 75 miles an hour down E470, so I apologize for.
Oh, no.
I think we had you there. Lieutenant Governor, is there anything you would add that you'd ask us to consider specific aspects of CATA?
Yeah, those of us who've been in government for a long time lay awake nights, I think, trying to confuse people about what we're talking about. So I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate the accountability portion, because if there is no accountability, there's really no point in having a law. So I'm very impressed by the comments so far. So thanks everybody for your work.
Thank you. And we're looking at 5 minutes, and I'm going to get everybody out of here on time. So lightning round, 30 seconds, and then follow up with me and Carrie by email of what you need to learn. Who has something that you want to get more background, more information, or presentations on any of the aspects you heard to be able to have informed conversations? I will go first to Andrew.
Thank you, Barrick. This is Andrew Montoya. Kind of looking at who's here, I've got some expertise on public accommodation and public entity law. Ian, I know, has some expertise in employment law. It seems the one perspective we're missing, we've also got the business folks here. The one perspective we seem to be missing is housing advocates and housing providers. So if we could maybe get some expertise around housing, that would be helpful.
Noted. And I appreciate you naming that. Cindy, you're off mute. Did you want to jump in with a thought? This is Barrick.
Yeah, this is Cindy. No, I don't necessarily have a specific idea of what I need to know, but I wondered if we might have access to a shared folder where we can perhaps share some best practices from other states for review by other members, specific to some of the areas that we're going to be working on.
The short answer is absolutely yes. Carrie and I will put together a shared drive working with our partners at DORA. What I will ask is that you send those materials to Carrie and me, just so we can have some base level of checking what we're putting in there before we say this is something everybody should read. But I think it's a great idea. We will make that happen.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Any other requests? And again, I know this whole thing is drinking by fire hose for a lot of folks. So when I ask a question, the door remains open long after this call. Lauren, and then Ian.
Yeah, mine is more of a request for clarification about this. I'm calling it the brain trust, and it was mentioned in the agenda, but when you the facilitators have asked us to bring other resources to this group, I'm still not clear what that looks like, or who to ask, or what to ask them for. I could come up with 100 names of folks who could advise me outside of this group, but could you provide some clarification on that?
Absolutely. And I want this is for everybody on this call. We don't have a specific ask that we have of stakeholders at this moment, but there's a lot more people in Colorado that have a lot of lived experience with these issues. And what we want is to be able to have as broad of input and as diverse of input as possible as you all start shaping ideas. So we will work with all of you and with the executive committee, with the full task force, to say, is this something we should stress test or solicit additional input from the public with? That, does this short list feel right? Is it missing things? Do these basic ideas to consider, do these make sense? So for those things, we'd like to be able to reach out, whether it's through focus groups, surveys, one-on-one conversations with everybody from individuals that bring a unique or a lived experience to organizations or officials that represent different constituencies. So, Lauren, it's not a specific ask of, I need 12 names to ask about this topic. It's more thinking about, from your network, who are more voices that we can test this against. Our goal is to have the broadest possible input so that we do mitigate against somebody saying, I didn't have a chance to weigh in. And so when we hand this off to the state, they've had the broadest input. So it's a thinking about who can we bounce ideas off to get more perspectives and frankly, more people aware of this work. Ian, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, Barrick, I did. Thank you. Ian Kalmanowitz. I do think that it would be helpful for us to have some data about litigation and litigation related statistics as we move forward through these discussions. When we get to talking about things like expanding protections and, potentially increasing the availability of damages or rolling back exhaustion, my experience has been that when those sorts of discussions happen, then a follow-up is that there's a concern that there's going to be a huge increase in litigation. and that those litigation costs are going to be detrimental to governmental entities or private businesses. I know that the CCRD keeps statistics of the charges that are filed, the cause findings that are issued. I don't know if they have statistics on the number of cause findings that get litigated by the Attorney General's office. But I think it would also be worthwhile if we could get similar statistics from outside of Colorado, particularly from states that might have more broad protections already in place for their citizens. For, you know, whether it be in if Texas has adopted the DOJ's accessibility standards and made it part of their law, you know, has the adoption of those standards led to more litigation in Texas on access issues than exist in a state that doesn't have those standards as part of their law. Likewise, with states where, you know, there's more broad protections for employment discrimination or for public accommodation discrimination, you know, was there an uptick in litigation, you know, or not? And, you know, because I do think that those discussions that data rather is crucial to these discussions, because I think it dispels a lot of the myths about what happens when these protections are enhanced.
I appreciate you naming that. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to bring to be having informed discussions instead of speculative. So we will include that in the information we start to assemble and put into an arc of conversations. We're at 1 minute past. I'm going to apologize for that. We have two meetings. Then our next two meetings will be on Monday, November 20th, and then Monday, December 4th. Both of those 11:30 to 1. We will follow up with everybody to make sure you get materials well in advance. Also, on the question of resources, if you already have some, send them our way. You can send them to Carrie, CARRIE, at confluencepsg.com. You should have our emails. If not, just reply to one of these invites or emails and you'll get us. But I want to thank all of you. Representative Ortiz, Lieutenant Governor, thank you for your leadership on this and for joining us. We will follow up with some summaries and information ahead of our next meeting. Enjoy the week and thank you for your time today.